The blood-stained letter trembled in Lillian Harlow's hands. It felt like a dead thing, cold and brittle. She stumbled through the dust-choked streets of Willow Creek, Arizona, a ghost in a gray dress. The year was 1877, and her future had just been buried under a pile of rock and lies. Her fiancé, Thomas, was dead, or so the letter claimed. He was supposed to come back with gold, enough to build them a life far from the smog of Boston. Instead, he lay cold in the ground of a mining camp she'd never even heard of. An explosion, the letter said. A tragic accident. Condolences offered. The words were as cheap as the paper they were written on. Lillian clutched the tattered valise that held everything she owned. Her dress hung loose, a constant reminder of the weeks she'd spent starving on the Stagecoach West. She'd spent her last dollar on that ticket, a final, desperate bet on a dead man's promises. The scorching June sun beat down, unforgiving. This wasn't the land of opportunity Thomas had described in his letters. It was a vast, empty furnace, and at 22 years old, she was utterly alone. No money, no prospects, and no way back. She had one last stop to make, the mining office. She had to claim whatever he'd left behind, a piece of him, any piece at all. As she dragged her feet toward the squat wooden building, a voice cut through the haze of her grief. "Missy, you look like you could use some help." Lillian turned. A tall man watched her from the shade of the general store's awning. His face was hidden by the brim of his hat, but the concern in his voice was plain. She gripped her bag tighter, her knuckles white. "I'm quite all right, thank you," she replied, her voice stiff. "No offense intended, ma'am," he said, his voice a low rumble. "But you look about ready to faint in this heat." He stepped forward, his hand outstretched for her bag. A jolt of panic shot through her. "Don't touch me," she whispered, the words catching in her throat. Weeks of fending off leering men on the journey had taught her to fear a helping hand. It was never just a helping hand. The stranger stopped dead in his tracks. He slowly lowered his arm. "I'll only hold you safe, miss. Name's Reed Xavier. I work at the Silver Spur Ranch outside town. Just offering a gentleman's courtesy." Something in his steady gaze made her pause. There was no sly grin, no predatory glint in his eyes. Just concern. Genuine and unwavering. She felt a sliver of her carefully constructed wall begin to crumble. "I apologize for my rudeness, Mr. Xavier," she said, forcing her shoulders back. "I'm not myself today. I'm Lillian Harlow. I've come to collect my late fiancé's belongings from the mining office." Reed's expression softened with something that looked like pity, but there was something else there too, a flicker of recognition that seemed too quick, too knowing. "Thomas Harper," he said. It wasn't a question. Lillian's breath hitched. "Yes. Did you know him?" "Everyone knew of the accident," Reed said, his eyes glancing across the street to the mining office. "A terrible tragedy. I'm sorry for your loss, Miss Harlow." He paused, his gaze hardening slightly. "Mr. Winters in there. He isn't the most sympathetic man. Would you like me to accompany you?" The thought of facing another cold, dismissive official alone was unbearable. She hated appearing weak, but her strength was failing. She gave a small, reluctant nod. "Thank you. That would be appreciated." As they crossed the street, the dust swirling around their ankles, she studied him from the corner of her eye. Sun-weathered skin, a small scar near his right temple. He walked with a quiet confidence that was both reassuring and unsettling. He seemed to know this town, this office, this whole damn situation a little too well. The mining office was an oven. A single dusty window was nailed shut against the heat. Behind a scarred desk sat a balding man, Mr. Winters, his spectacles perched on his nose. He didn't even look up as they entered. "Mr. Winters," Reed said, his voice polite but firm. "This is Miss Harlow. She's come about Thomas Harper's effects." The man finally lifted his eyes, his expression as barren as the landscape outside. "Harper. Oh, right. The Boston boy. Died in the tunnel collapse last month." Lillian flinched. He said it like he was reading a grocery list. "Yes," she managed to say. "I received your letter." Winters shuffled through a stack of papers, his disinterest a physical blow. "Not much to collect, I'm afraid. Harper hadn't been with us long enough to earn much." He pushed a small, greasy cloth bag across the desk. That's his final wages, minus the burial costs, of course. Her fingers trembled as she opened the drawstring. A few coins, not enough for a hotel room, not even enough for a decent meal. It was an insult. And his personal belongings? She asked, her voice dangerously quiet. Winters grunted, nodding toward a small wooden crate in the corner. It was barely bigger than a shoebox. Whatever was found is in that box. You can take it. Sign this receipt. As Lillian reached for the pen, Reed stepped forward, placing a hand gently on the desk. Miss Harlow has traveled all the way from Boston, sir. Surely the company can offer more compensation for her loss, for her journey. Winter's face turned to stone. The company isn't responsible for family members who choose to travel west without invitation. Harper knew the risks. Mining is dangerous work. His eyes were cold, final. Lillian snatched the pen and scribbled her name, desperate to escape the suffocating room before she shattered completely. Reed lifted the small crate without a word, his jaw tight. He nodded once to Winters, a gesture of pure, cold formality, and then guided her out into the blinding sunlight. Outside, Lillian finally let out the breath she'd been holding. It came out as a ragged sob. "Thank you," she whispered. I didn't expect them to treat him like just another number." Reed shifted the crate in his arms, his expression grim. "That's how it is out here sometimes. Companies care more about the gold in the ground than the men who died digging for it." His words were brutal, but they were true. And the way he said them, it sounded personal. Lillian blinked back tears, trying to anchor herself to the practical. "I should find lodging. Is there a respectable boarding house?" Reed hesitated, his gaze sweeping over her worn dress, the pathetic bag of coins still clutched in her hand. "Mrs. Wilson's place is decent, but she charges more than what you have there. The hotel's even more expensive." The reality of her situation crashed down on her with the weight of 1,000 tons of rock. Stranded, penniless, alone. Thomas had promised her a kingdom of gold. She'd been left with nothing but dust. "I see," she said, her voice hollow. "Perhaps I could seek employment first." Reed studied her for a long, quiet moment. He seemed to be weighing something in his mind. "Miss Harlow," he began, his tone careful, "I don't mean to overstep, but my employer, Mrs. Abigail Lawrence, she's looking for a governess for her 2 children. The last one left to get married a few weeks ago. The position, it includes room and board at the ranch. A governess. It felt like a lifeline thrown into a churning sea. I have some experience with children. I was a teacher's assistant in Boston." "Mrs. Lawrence is a widow," Reed continued, watching her reaction closely. "She runs the Silver Spur herself. She's fair, and the children are good kids. It would be respectable work. You'd be safe at the ranch until you decide what you want to do." Safe. The word echoed in the empty spaces of her heart. But was it too convenient? This kind stranger? This perfectly timed job offer? Her instincts, honed by weeks of survival, screamed at her to be wary. But her options were a choice between this and starving in the street. "Could you introduce me to Mrs. Lawrence?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. A flicker of relief crossed his face. "I've got the supply wagon just outside town. I can take you out to the ranch right now if you'd like." An hour later, Lillian was perched on the hard wooden seat of a wagon, bouncing along a rutted trail that led away from Willow Creek. Her valise and Thomas's small, sad crate were wedged between sacks of flour and coffee. The dusty streets gave way to endless stretches of sagebrush and distant hazy mountains. The silence between them was thick with unspoken questions. "How long have you worked at the Silver Spur?" she asked, needing to fill the quiet. "Almost 5 years now," Reed said, his eyes fixed on the trail ahead. "Came west after the war, with nothing but my horse and saddle. Mrs. Lawrence's husband hired me as a hand. When he died 3 years back, she kept me on as foreman." "You fought in the war?" A small, sad smile touched his lips. "Union cavalry. Enlisted at 17, though I told them I was 18. My father wasn't pleased." "Is your family back east?" He shook his head, a shadow passing over his features. "Lost them all. Pa to the war, ma to fever after. No siblings." He glanced at her, his eyes holding a shared understanding of loss. What about you? My parents died in 71. Influenza, she said, twisting her gloved hands in her lap. I was working as a teacher's assistant when I met Thomas. He was so certain there was a fortune to be made out here. There is gold in these hills, Reed said quietly, his voice taking on a strange, hard edge. It just costs more than most men expect to pay. They crested a small rise and the Silver Spur Ranch spread out before them. It was a sprawling oasis in the harsh landscape, with a large main house, several outbuildings and pastures that stretched toward the mountains. It was beautiful, a perfect picture of prosperity. It looked solid, secure. It looked safe. But as they drew closer, Lillian felt a prickle of unease. The place was almost too perfect, too fortified. The fences were high, the gates sturdy. It looked less like a home and more like a fortress. It's beautiful, she breathed, trying to ignore the knot tightening in her stomach. It's home, Reed replied simply. But his eyes were scanning the property, not with the comfortable gaze of a foreman, but with the sharp, assessing look of a watchman on duty. Mrs. Abigail Lawrence was a handsome woman in her early 40s, with streaks of silver in her dark hair and shrewd, intelligent eyes that missed nothing. She assessed Lillian from the moment she stepped into the parlor, her gaze lingering on the worn fabric of her dress, the grief etched on her face. Her two children, 10-year-old Daniel and 8-year-old Emma, watched silently from the grand staircase, their expressions unreadable. Lillian explained her situation, the words feeling thin and rehearsed. Mrs. Lawrence listened patiently, her hands folded primly in her lap. I am sorry for your loss, Miss Harlow, she said when Lillian had finished. Her voice was cultivated, with an Eastern accent that surprised Lillian. I know what it is to lose someone you love in this untamed country. She glanced at a stern portrait of a man hanging above the massive stone fireplace. Her late husband. The position pays $15 a month, plus room and board, she stated, her tone shifting to business. The children require lessons in reading, arithmetic, history, and of course, proper manners. Can you handle that? Yes, madam, Lillian said, relief washing over her so intensely she felt dizzy. I am well versed in those subjects. Very well. Mrs. Lawrence nodded, a decision made. Reed will show you to the governess's quarters. You may start tomorrow after you've had a chance to rest. Her expression softened, just for a moment. This is a respectable household, Miss Harlow. You will be treated with dignity here. The words were meant to be reassuring, but they felt like a warning. Reed carried her belongings to a small, pleasant room above the kitchen. It had a clean bed, a sturdy dresser, and a window that overlooked a manicured garden in the distant mountains. It was more than she could have hoped for. Dinner's at 6, he told her from the doorway. The washroom is down the hall. If you need anything, just ask. He hesitated, his gaze lingering on her face. You'll be all right here, Lillian. He used her first name. It slipped out so naturally it almost sounded like a promise. But as he turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing down the hall, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had just traded one trap for another. Left alone, Lillian finally opened the small wooden crate. Inside, beneath a few worn shirts and a tarnished pocket watch, was a worn leather Bible. There was no gold, no savings, nothing to show for his dreams, just the meager possessions of a failed man. She pressed her face into one of his shirts, breathing in the faint, dusty scent of him, and let the tears come. But as she wept, her fingers brushed against something hard tucked inside the Bible. It wasn't a bookmark. She pulled it out. It was a piece of rock, no bigger than her thumb. It wasn't gold. It was dark, almost black, but shot through with a vein of shimmering, brilliant silver. It was heavier than it looked, strangely dense. Thomas wasn't in a gold mine. He was in a silver mine. Tucked behind the rock was a small folded piece of paper. On it, in Thomas's familiar script, was a series of numbers and what looked like a hastily drawn map. It made no sense. A list of coordinates, maybe? A code? And at the bottom, one chilling phrase was scrawled. Not an accident. X knows X. As in Xavier? A cold dread washed over her, colder than any grief. The dismissive Mr. Winters. The too convenient job offer from a kind stranger named Reed Xavier. the fortified ranch run by a watchful widow. Thomas hadn't died in a random tunnel collapse. He had been silenced, and the man who had just promised to keep her safe might be the very reason she was in danger. The weeks that followed were a blur of deceptive calm. Lillian threw herself into teaching Daniel and Emma, her days falling into a comforting routine. The children were bright and curious, a welcome distraction from the fear that gnawed at her insides. Daniel had a mind for numbers and puzzles, while Emma devoured every book Lillian put in front of her. They were good children, but they were also their mother's children. She would often find them watching her, their young faces betraying a solemn, knowing gravity that was unnatural for their age. She kept the silver oar and the coded note hidden, tucked away in a loose floorboard beneath her bed. It was her only secret, her only weapon, in a place where she felt constantly observed. Reed Xavier was a ghost, a constant presence at the edge of her vision. He was polite, always respectful, but a wall of professional distance stood between them. She saw him managing the ranch hands, his competence undeniable. But she also saw other things. She saw the way the other hands deferred to him, not just as a foreman, but as something more. They weren't just cowboys, they moved with a discipline that spoke of military training. They were guards. Sometimes late at night, she would see a single lamp burning in his small cabin near the bunkhouse, long after the rest of the ranch was dark. She would catch him staring at her from across the yard, his expression unreadable. When their eyes met, he would give a slow, respectful nod and turn away, leaving her with a fresh wave of chilling uncertainty. Was it concern she saw in his eyes, or was it calculation? One evening in late July, she sat on the porch, a book open in her lap. The children were in bed, and the sun was bleeding gold and purple across the mountain peaks. The raw beauty of this place was a constant, cruel paradox. It was a beautiful prison. "Nice evening," Reed said from the bottom of the steps. He moved so quietly she hadn't heard him approach. It startled her, and she nearly dropped her book. "It is," she agreed, her heart thumping against her ribs. She closed the book, her hands suddenly clammy. He leaned against the porch railing, his dusty boots crossed at the ankles. He seemed relaxed, but she knew better. He was never truly relaxed. "Mrs. Lawrence says the children are doing well with their studies." "They're intelligent children," she said, her voice tight. "Daniel has a gift for mathematics. Emma absorbs books like a sponge." A silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. She could feel him studying her, and she resisted the urge to squirm under his gaze. "You're adjusting well to ranch life," he finally said. "Not everyone from the East does." "I had little choice," she replied, the words sharper than she intended. She immediately regretted it. "I apologize, that sounded ungrateful." "No need to apologize for honesty," he said, his expression thoughtful. "This wasn't the life you planned." "No," she whispered, looking down at her hands. The engagement ring Thomas had given her felt heavy, a circle of lies. "Thomas and I were going to build a home. We had so many plans." "Plans have a way of changing out here," he said, his voice low. He straightened up as if to leave, but then he hesitated. "Some of the hands and I are breaking horses tomorrow. The children enjoy watching. You might bring them out to the corral after their morning lessons if you'd like." The invitation was unexpected. A test, perhaps? An offer of a carefully curated peek behind the curtain? "I'm sure they would enjoy that," she said, her voice betraying none of her inner turmoil. The next day she stood by the corral fence, Daniel on one side, Emma on the other. Reed was in the center of the ring, a coiled rope in his hand, his movements fluid and confident. He was working with a wild-eyed Mustang, speaking to it in a low, calming voice. He wasn't breaking the horse's spirit. He was earning its trust. It was a masterful display of patience and strength. Suddenly, a commotion erupted at the far end of the corral. One of the other hands, a young, inexperienced cowboy, was thrown from his mount. The horse, a massive black stallion, bolted. But it didn't run for the open gate. It charged directly toward the fence, directly toward them. The children screamed. Lillian instinctively shoved them behind her, her body forming a flimsy shield. The ground thundered. The horse's eyes were white with panic. There was no time to run. In a blur of motion, Reed was there. He spurred his own horse, intercepting the charging stallion, his body a shield between them and the danger. He reached out, his hands snatching for the trailing lead rope. The two horses collided with a sickening thud. Reed was thrown from the saddle. He hit the ground hard and lay still, a crumpled heap in the dust as the panicked horses veered away. For a moment, the world went silent. Then Lillian was running, her skirts flying, her heart pounding in her throat. She knelt beside him, her hands hovering over his still form, afraid to touch him. Blood trickled from a gash on his forehead. "Mr. Xavier!" "Reed?" she whispered, her voice shaking. His eyes fluttered open. They were dazed, confused. "Miss Harlow?" "Don't move," she ordered, her voice surprisingly firm. She ripped a strip of cloth from her petticoat and pressed it against the wound on his head. "You might have broken something." He managed a weak, pained smile. "Only my pride, I think." He tried to sit up, but a sharp groan escaped his lips and he clutched his side. "What did I just say about not moving?" she scolded, gently pushing him back down. His body was tense with pain. The other hands rushed over, their faces pale with shock. They helped carry him to his cabin, his arms draped over their shoulders. As they moved past her, Lillian's gaze fell on the young cowboy who had been thrown, now sheepishly collecting his hat from the dust. He met her eyes for a split second, and in that fleeting moment, she saw it. It wasn't panic. It wasn't remorse. It was fear. But it was the fear of a subordinate who had just failed a critical mission. That horse hadn't bolted by accident. It had been spooked, deliberately. The charge wasn't random. It was a message, a warning. And Reed Xavier hadn't just saved her life. He had ruined someone's plan. Later that day, after the doctor had come and gone, confirming 2 broken ribs and a mild concussion, Lillian brought a tray of soup to Reed's cabin. He was propped up in bed, his forehead bandaged, his face pale beneath his tan. He looked frustrated, a caged animal. "Mrs. Lawrence asked me to make sure you ate something," she said, setting the tray on a small table beside his bed, "and to thank you for protecting the children." "Just doing my job," he grunted, wincing as he shifted his weight. "Throwing yourself in front of a charging stallion is not in any foreman's job description I've ever read," she countered, her voice soft. She sat in the single wooden chair by his bed. "That was no accident, was it?" His eyes snapped to hers, sharp and alert despite the pain. The lazy cowboy persona fell away, replaced by something harder, more dangerous. "What makes you say that?" The way the horse ran, the look on the young man's face afterward. It was a warning. Wasn't it? For me. Reed held her gaze for a long moment, a silent battle of wills passing between them. Finally, he gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. "They're getting nervous," he said, his voice a low growl. "You asking questions in town, poking around." "They?" she pressed. "Winters? Mrs. Lawrence?" "Both," he confirmed. "And others. This operation is bigger than just a crooked mine manager." He took a shallow breath, pain flickering across his face. "Thomas figured it out. That's why they killed him." The casual confirmation of her deepest fear hit her like a physical blow. "And the note he left, X knows. That's you." "Yes." The single word hung in the air between them, pregnant with 100 more questions. "Who are you, Reed?" "Really?" He stared at the rough-hewn ceiling of his cabin. "My name is Reed Xavier. That much is true. But my brother's name was Jacob. He was a geologist. He came out here 6 months ago, hired by the Willow Creek Mining Company to survey new claims. He wrote me letters, excited about a massive silver lode he'd found, the richest he'd ever seen. Then the letter stopped. A month later, I received a notice. He died in a saloon fire. Tragic accident. The same words, the same lies. I didn't believe it for a second," Reed continued, his voice laced with cold fury. "Jacob didn't drink. He never went to saloons. I was a Pinkerton agent. I took a leave of absence and came to investigate. I got a job here at the Silver Spur because Jacob's last letter mentioned his discovery was near the ranch's northern border. I quickly realized the ranch wasn't just near the operation. It is the operation." It all clicked into place. The guards, the fortress-like security, Mrs. Lawrence's watchful eyes. "She's in on it. Her husband?" "Her husband found out what they were doing on his land. He threatened to expose them. He died of a heart attack a week later, Reed said grimly. Abigail Lawrence is not a grieving widow. She's a partner, and she's twice as ruthless as Winters. She runs this place with an iron fist. So what are they doing? Just mining silver illegally? Reed shook his head. It's more than that. The lode Jacob and Thomas found, it's almost pure. The government has strict regulations on veins that rich. It's federal land, which means massive taxes and oversight. They're running a ghost mine, using non-existent claims to launder the silver, shipping it out as low-grade ore from their legitimate gold mine. They've murdered at least a dozen men to keep it secret. Your fiancé was the latest. Lillian felt a wave of nausea. She looked down at her hands, at the engagement ring she still wore. It wasn't a symbol of love. It was a tombstone. The note, she said, her voice trembling. Thomas left a coded note and a map. Reed's eyes widened. He pushed himself up, ignoring the searing pain in his ribs. A note? A map? Where is it? Hidden. In my room. We need to decipher it. It could be the location of the ghost mine. It's the proof I need to bring in the marshals. He looked at her, his gaze intense. Lillian, you're in more danger than you can possibly imagine. Mrs. Lawrence let you stay here for one reason, to keep an eye on you, to see what you knew. Today was their way of telling you to stop looking. She finally understood. Her quiet, respectable job as a governess was a lie. She was a prisoner, living in the heart of the conspiracy that had gotten her fiancé killed. And the only person she could possibly trust was a man who had been lying to her since the moment they met. What do we do? She asked, the words feeling small and powerless. We play their game, Reed said, his jaw set. We pretend that today worked, that you're scared, that you'll keep your head down and just be a quiet little school teacher. We let them think they have you under control. He reached out, his hand covering hers. His touch was warm, steady. And then, when they're not looking, we burn them to the ground. A fragile, dangerous alliance was forged in that small, rustic cabin, built on a foundation of shared grief and a thirst for justice. From that day on, Lillian and Reed lived a double life. To the outside world, he was the recovering foreman, and she was the timid governess, frightened into submission by the accident at the corral. But in secret, they were partners in a conspiracy of their own. They met in the dead of night, in the darkness of the stables or the deep shadows of the porch, whispering plans and piecing together the puzzle. Lillian's room, once a sanctuary, now felt like the most dangerous place on the ranch. She retrieved the note and the silver ore from beneath the floorboard, her heart hammering with every creak of the house. She brought the note to Reed. He studied it under the dim light of a shielded lantern, his brow furrowed in concentration. It's a book cipher, he muttered, more to himself than to her. The numbers correspond to pages, lines, and words in a specific book. Which book? Lillian asked. That's the question. It would have to be a book he knew you both had, or one he was certain would be among his effects. Her eyes widened. The Bible. The mining company gave me his Bible. It was in the crate. They spent the next night hunched over the worn leather volume, the coded note beside them. The first set of numbers was 1:17:4. Psalm 1:10, verse 17, fourth word. Deal, Lillian whispered, tracing the word with her finger. The next was 45:11. Psalm 45, verse 1, first word. My. Slowly, painstakingly, they worked their way through the numbers. It was a cryptic, disjointed message. Deal, my heart is indicting. A good matter. I speak of the things which I have made, touching the king. My tongue is the pen of a ready writer. It was a direct quote from the psalm. It wasn't the message. It's not the words themselves, Reed said, frustration evident in his voice. He ran a hand through his hair. It's a key of some kind. He's telling us how to read the map. Lillian looked again at the strange, spidery map Thomas had drawn. It was a series of lines and symbols with no clear landmarks. But then she noticed it. At the top of the page, Thomas had drawn a small, stylized crown. The king, she breathed, touching the king. The message is about the king. Reed's eyes lit up. The King James Bible, of course. But what does it mean? That's when Daniel, her brilliant puzzle-loving student, became their unwitting accomplice. During their lessons the next day, Lillian gave him a series of riddles to solve, complex numerical puzzles that mimicked the structure of Thomas's code. She presented the map as a game, a treasure map from a storybook. "It's not a map of a place, Miss Harlow," Daniel announced proudly after studying it for an hour. "It's a map of a calendar. See? These lines mark the months, and these symbols are the phases of the moon. And this mark here," he pointed to a specific spot, "this is the next full moon." The next full moon, it was less than a week away. "And what about this, Daniel?" Reed asked, joining them on the porch and pointing to the crown on the map. "What does the king mean?" Daniel tapped his chin thoughtfully. "In a lot of old ciphers, the king represents the key itself. It's the starting point. Maybe, maybe you're supposed to overlay something on the map, starting where the crown is." Later that night, Lillian and Reed met in the stables, the smell of hay and leather thick around them. Reed held the map, and Lillian held Thomas's tarnished silver pocket watch. On the back of the watch was an intricate engraving of a stag, its antlers forming a complex branching pattern, a crown of antlers. "The king," Reed whispered, his voice filled with awe. He opened the watch case. Holding it carefully over the map, he aligned the center of the engraving with the crown symbol Thomas had drawn. The lines of the antlers fell perfectly across the calendar map. One specific tine, the longest, pointed directly to a date square, marked with a small, almost invisible X. The date of the next full moon, and next to that square was another set of coordinates, different from the book cipher. These had to be the location. They had it. The location of the ghost mine, and the date of what was likely the next major shipment. Their victory was short-lived. Their nightly meetings, however careful, had not gone unnoticed. Mrs. Lawrence's pleasantries grew colder, her smiles tighter. She began assigning Lillian extra duties, keeping her busy late into the evening, making it impossible for her to slip away. She would appear at the schoolroom door during lessons, her presence a silent, looming threat. The atmosphere on the ranch grew tense, charged with suspicion. The ranch hands watched Reed's every move, their loyalty clearly with the woman who paid their wages, not the foreman who gave them orders. One afternoon, as Lillian was walking back from the schoolroom, Mrs. Lawrence stopped her in the hallway. "Miss Harlow," she said, her voice smooth as silk. "A word, if you please." She gestured toward the parlor. Lillian's blood ran cold. She followed the older woman into the room, her hands trembling slightly. Mrs. Lawrence closed the doors behind them. The stern-faced man in the portrait seemed to glare down at her. "You've been a wonderful influence on the children," Mrs. Lawrence began, her back to Lillian as she poured 2 glasses of sherry. "Daniel's arithmetic has improved remarkably, and Emma speaks of you with great affection." She turned, offering a glass to Lillian. Her eyes were like chips of ice. "It is a shame your time with us must come to an end." Lillian's heart stopped. "Madam?" "You will be leaving on the morning stagecoach," Mrs. Lawrence said, her voice dropping its polite veneer. It was now cold, hard steel. "I have written a generous letter of recommendation for you, and a bonus, enough to see you comfortably back to Boston." It wasn't a dismissal, it was an expulsion, a threat. "But I don't understand," Lillian stammered, playing the part of the confused, innocent governess. "Have I done something to displease you?" Mrs. Lawrence took a slow sip of her sherry. "Let's not play games, Miss Harlow. This territory is no place for a grieving fiancé to be asking questions. Your Thomas was a fool. He got greedy. He learned a difficult lesson about minding his own business." Her gaze was sharp, penetrating. "A lesson I strongly suggest you take to heart." She set her glass down with a decisive click. "Your bags will be packed for you. Reed will take you to town in the morning. Do not speak to him. Do not speak to the children. You will get on that stagecoach, and you will forget you ever saw Willow Creek." The threat was clear. If she wasn't on that stagecoach, she would end up in the ground, just like Thomas. That night, Lillian knew it was their last chance. There would be no morning. She scribbled a frantic note and slipped it under her door, praying the loyal stable boy she'd befriended would find it and deliver it to Reed. The note contained only 3 words. Tonight, she knows. Hours crawled by. The house fell silent. Lillian sat on her bed, fully dressed, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind outside, sounded like approaching doom. Just after midnight, she heard a soft scratching at her window. Reed was there, a dark silhouette against the moonlit sky. He had thrown a rope over a thick tree branch, and it dangled just outside her reach. She forced the window open, the old wood groaning in protest. "They're watching the house," he whispered, his voice urgent. "The young hand, the one from the corral. He's posted by the front door. We have to go now." Lillian climbed out the window, her skirts catching on the frame. The ground seemed to sway sickeningly below her. Her hands were slick with sweat as she gripped the rough rope. Reed coached her from below, his voice a calming anchor in her sea of panic. She half slid, half fell the last few feet, landing unsteadily in his arms. For a moment they stood there clinging to each other in the darkness. His arms were strong, secure. She could feel the steady beat of his heart against her cheek. "The map," he breathed into her hair. "Did you bring it?" "Yes," she whispered, pulling it from her pocket. "Good. The full moon is tomorrow night. We have one chance to get to the mine and expose them before they move the shipment and disappear." They crept toward the stables, moving from shadow to shadow. The air was cold, still. The ranch was asleep, but it felt like a sleeping predator, ready to awaken at the slightest sound. They reached the stable doors and slipped inside. The familiar smell of horse and hay was comforting, but the silence was unnerving. Too unnerving. Reed froze, his hand on the saddle of his horse. He held a finger to his lips, his eyes scanning the deep shadows in the barn's loft. And then the world exploded in light. Lanterns flared to life all around them. They were surrounded. Mrs. Lawrence stood in the center of the barn, a shotgun held loosely in her hands. Winters was beside her, a cruel sneer on his face, and flanking them were a dozen ranch hands, all armed, their faces grim. The young cowboy who had caused the accident stepped forward from the shadows, a length of rope in his hands. He looked ashamed but resolute. "I'm sorry, boss," he said to Reed. "She offered me double." Mrs. Lawrence smiled, a cold, predatory curving of her lips. "Did you really think you could deceive me in my own home, Mr. Xavier? Or should I say, Mr. Pinkerton?" Her eyes glittered with triumph. "I must admit, using the governess was a clever touch. You almost had me believing your little romance." She gestured with the shotgun toward Lillian. "And you, my dear, I offered you a respectable way out, a comfortable journey home. But like your fiancé, you just couldn't leave well enough alone." Reed stepped in front of Lillian, shielding her with his body. His hand moved slowly toward the pistol holstered at his hip. "Don't even think about it," Winters snarled, leveling his own revolver at Reed's chest. "It's over," Mrs. Lawrence said, her voice echoing in the silent barn. "You have nothing, no proof, no witnesses." Lillian's mind raced. They were caught. It was hopeless. But then her eyes fell on the hayloft, on the complex system of ropes and pulleys used for lifting bales. And she remembered something Daniel had told her during a lesson on simple machines, about leverage and counterweights. "You're wrong," Lillian said, her voice shaking but clear. She held up the map. "We have this, the location of your ghost mine, the one you killed my fiancé for." Winter's eyes widened in fury, and he took a step toward her. "Give me that." It was the distraction they needed. "Now!" Reed yelled. He drew his pistol in a blur of motion, firing not at Winters, but at the main support rope for the hayloft pulley system. The thick rope snapped with a sound like a gunshot. A massive half-ton bale of hay, suspended high above them, came crashing down. It landed directly between them and Mrs. Lawrence's men, sending up a blinding cloud of dust and straw. In the chaos, Reed grabbed Lillian's hand. "Run!" They scrambled for the back door of the stables as angry shouts and panicked shots erupted behind them. A bullet splintered the doorframe next to Lillian's head. They burst out into the cold night air and ran for the only cover they could find, the dark, unforgiving wilderness that bordered the ranch. They ran until their lungs burned and their legs screamed in protest. The sounds of pursuit faded behind them, replaced by the chirping of crickets and the frantic pounding of their own hearts. They didn't stop until they reached the relative safety of a rocky outcrop several miles from the ranch. Lillian collapsed to the ground, gasping for air. Reed stood watch, his pistol in his hand, his body a tense silhouette against the starry sky. "They'll come after us," she said, her voice hoarse. "I know," he replied, not taking his eyes off the darkness. "But they'll be searching the roads, the trails leading to town. They'll think we're trying to get to the marshal." "We are trying to get to the marshal, aren't we?" He finally turned to look at her, his face grim in the faint starlight. "The marshal in Willow Creek is on Winters's payroll. That's the first thing I learned when I got here. Going to him would be a death sentence. There's no one to call for help, Lillian. We're on our own." The hope that had sustained her crumbled into dust. They were fugitives, hunted in a land where their enemies owned the law. "So what do we do?" she whispered, the full weight of their desperate situation settling upon her. "We just run?" Reed knelt in front of her, taking her cold hands in his. His gaze was steady, intense. "No, we don't run. We finish what we started. The full moon is tonight. They'll be at the mine moving the silver. It's our only chance. We can't bring the law to them, so we'll bring them to the law." "How?" "By creating enough chaos that the federal marshal in Prescott has no choice but to ride out here and investigate. We're not going to just expose them, Lillian. We're going to destroy them. We'll use their own greed, their own mind against them." He squeezed her hands, his determination a tangible force. "But it's dangerous. More dangerous than anything we've faced yet. You don't have to do this. I can take you somewhere safe, leave you there." Lillian looked into his eyes. In them, she saw the reflection of her own grief, her own rage. This was for Thomas. This was for Reed's brother, Jacob. This was for all the men buried in unmarked graves for the sake of that cursed silver. "No," she said, her voice firm, unwavering. "They took my future from me. I'll be damned if I let them take anything else." She straightened her shoulders, a new hard resolve settling deep in her bones. "What's the plan?" The ghost mine was carved into the side of a remote, windswept mesa, its entrance hidden by a clever screen of rock and deadfall. It was exactly where Thomas's map said it would be. Crouched behind a cluster of boulders, Lillian and Reed watched as the full moon rose, bathing the desolate landscape in an eerie silver light. Down below, the scene was a hive of activity. Mules, heavily laden with canvas sacks, were being led out of the mine by a half-dozen armed guards. Mrs. Lawrence and Winters stood near a makeshift forge, overseeing the operation. The air smelled of sulfur and greed. "That's it," Reed whispered, his voice tight. "Pure silver. They're loading it onto an unmarked wagon. By sunrise, it'll be on a train heading east, lost in a sea of legitimate cargo." "There are so many of them," Lillian breathed, her heart sinking. There were at least 15 armed men, not including Winters and the widow. It was a suicide mission. "We don't have to fight all of them," Reed said, pulling a small bundle from his saddlebag. "We just have to create a diversion, a big one." He unrolled the bundle, revealing several sticks of dynamite and a long fuse. "Winters was careless. I was able to lift these from the company office my first week in town. I was saving them for a special occasion." His plan was simple and insane. While he created a diversion at the mine entrance, Lillian was to sneak around to the back of the mesa, where a ventilation shaft was marked on Thomas's map. She was to drop a single, lit stick of dynamite down the shaft. It wouldn't be enough to cause a major collapse, but it would be enough to block the main tunnel, trapping the silver and their enemies inside. "It will seal them in," Reed explained, his eyes glinting in the moonlight. "It'll cause a panic. When they realize the front entrance is also blocked by a rock slide from my diversion, they'll be trapped like rats. The resulting explosion and fire will be visible for miles. The federal marshal in Prescott won't be able to ignore a catastrophe of that magnitude. He'll have to investigate." He handed her a single stick of dynamite and a matchbook. Her hand trembled as she took them. "Reed, this is crazy," she whispered. "I know." He reached out and cupped her cheek, his thumb gently stroking her skin. His touch was warm, real, a stark contrast to the cold fear coiling in her gut. "Lillian, whatever happens, Don't, she interrupted, placing her fingers on his lips. Don't say it. We're going to get through this. Together. He nodded, his eyes holding hers for a long moment. Then he squeezed her hand, a silent promise, and slipped away into the shadows. Lillian's journey to the back of the mesa was a nightmare of stumbling over loose rock and hiding from the moon. Every snap of a twig, every hoot of an owl, sent a fresh jolt of terror through her. She finally found it, a small dark hole in the ground, covered by a crude iron grate. A steady stream of warm, foul-smelling air rose from its depths. She took a deep breath, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold the match. She struck it against the rock, the small flame flaring to life, a tiny beacon of defiance in the vast darkness. She touched the flame to the fuse. It sizzled, spitting sparks. She had 10 seconds. Just as she was about to drop it, a hand clamped down on her shoulder from behind. She screamed, spinning around to see the face of the young cowboy, the traitor from the barn. His eyes were wide with panic. "Don't do it, miss," he pleaded, his voice a ragged whisper. "She'll kill us all. She's gone mad." Before Lillian could react, a massive explosion ripped through the night from the front of the mine. The ground shook violently. A plume of fire and smoke shot into the sky. Reed's diversion. The young cowboy stared at the fiery spectacle, his face a mask of horror. He did it. The crazy fool actually did it. In that moment of distraction, Lillian acted. She slammed the butt of the dynamite stick against his temple. He grunted and staggered back, stunned. Without a second thought, she dropped the hissing stick of dynamite down the shaft. "Run!" she screamed at him, grabbing his arm and dragging him away from the opening. They had barely made it 20 feet when a deep, guttural roar erupted from the earth. The ground bucked beneath them, throwing them to their knees. A geyser of rock and dust shot out of the ventilation shaft, followed by a thick, black cloud of smoke. They had done it. They had sealed the tomb. They scrambled to the edge of the mesa and looked down. The scene below was one of pure chaos. The mine entrance was completely blocked by a massive rock slide from Reed's explosion. The men were shouting, running in circles, trapped between the collapsed entrance and the fire that was now raging through their camp. And then she saw him. Reed. He was pinned down behind the wagon, exchanging gunfire with Winters, who had taken cover behind a stack of silver sacks. "Stay here," Lillian told the young cowboy. "Or run. I don't care. But I'm going down there." She didn't wait for a reply. She found a steep, treacherous path down the side of the mesa and began to run, sliding and stumbling in the loose shale. Adrenaline coursed through her veins, silencing her fear. She reached the bottom just as Winters let out a triumphant yell. Reed's gun had fallen silent. He was out of ammunition. Winters stood up, leveling his revolver for the killing shot. "It's over, Pinkerton," he bellowed over the roar of the flames. "No, it's not," Lillian said, her voice surprisingly steady. Winters spun around, his eyes wide with shock. He hadn't seen her approach. In her hand, she held the heavy, silver-veined piece of ore she had carried all the way from Willow Creek, the rock Thomas had died for. With a cry of pure, primal rage, she threw it with all her might. It struck Winters square in the forehead with a sickening crack. He staggered back, his eyes rolling up in his head, and collapsed like a puppet with its strings cut. Silence descended, broken only by the crackle of the fire. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the smoke near the collapsed mine entrance. It was Mrs. Lawrence, her beautiful face smudged with soot, her eyes wild with fury. In her hands, she still held the shotgun. "You!" she hissed, her voice a venomous whisper. "You ruined everything." She raised the shotgun, taking aim at Lillian. A single shot rang out, echoing across the mesa. But it wasn't from the shotgun. Mrs. Lawrence jerked, a look of surprise on her face. A small, dark hole appeared in the bodice of her expensive dress. She looked down, then back up at Lillian, her mouth opening as if to say something. Then she crumpled to the ground. Reed stood a few feet away, Winters's revolver now in his hand. He walked slowly toward Lillian, his face grim. The firelight danced in his eyes, reflecting the devastation around them. He stopped in front of her, his gaze searching her face. He reached out, his fingers gently brushing a smudge of dirt from her cheek. "It's over," he said. his voice raw with exhaustion and relief. It's finally over. In the distance, they could hear the faint, rhythmic sound of approaching horses. Lots of them. The law was coming. Not the corrupt town marshal, but the real law, drawn by the fire in the sky. Lillian looked at the carnage around them. The fire, the collapsed mine, the bodies of the people who had murdered the man she was supposed to marry. She should have felt something. Grief, triumph, satisfaction. Instead, she just felt empty, tired. She looked at Reed, the man who had lied to her, protected her, and fought beside her. The man who was a stranger, yet knew her better than anyone. He holstered the pistol and opened his arms. She stepped into them without hesitation, burying her face in his chest. His embrace was solid, real. He held her tight as the sound of hoofbeats grew louder, a promise of justice finally arriving in a land that had known none. She had come west seeking a future of gold and love, and had found only silver and death. But as she stood there, held safely in Reed's arms, she realized her journey wasn't over. It was just beginning. 5 years later, Lillian stood on the porch of a small, sturdy house, her house, watching the sun set behind the distant mountains. The sky was painted in the same brilliant oranges and purples that had once seemed so cruel, but now felt like a promise. The Silver Spur Ranch had been seized by the federal government. The story of the ghost mine, of the ruthless widow and her corrupt partners, had become a local legend. After months of testimony and trials, justice, true and final, had been served. With the reward money and the small inheritance from Thomas that was finally, rightfully released to her, she and Reed had bought their own piece of land. It wasn't a sprawling empire like the Silver Spur. It was a modest homestead with a few dozen cattle, a field of corn, and a quiet creek running through it. It was enough. It was theirs. Reed came up the porch steps, his boots dusty from a long day's work. He wrapped his arms around her waist from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the last sliver of sun disappear. "Any regrets?" he asked softly. It was a question he still asked sometimes, his voice always tinged with a hint of insecurity, as if he still couldn't believe she had chosen this life. Chosen him. She turned in his arms, her hands coming up to cup his face. She looked into his eyes, the same steady, honest eyes that had first caught her attention in a dusty street in Willow Creek. "Not one," she answered truthfully. She had lost a future she thought she wanted, only to find a life she never could have imagined, a life forged in fire and truth. "This is exactly where I'm meant to be." His kiss was tender, familiar, a testament to the quiet, powerful love that had grown from the ashes of their shared past. Life in the West would always have its challenges, its harshness, but she knew that here, in his arms, she was finally truly safe. If you enjoyed the story of justice in the Old West, don't forget to subscribe